comes off mute but is not speaking. Thank you, Ellen. Just helping mute anyone that has some loud background noise, but we do encourage you to unmute if you want to. If we call on you, please use the reactions tool in the toolbar for WBAC members during the portion of the actual WBAC meeting, so we can address questions as we go, but saving public comment till the end. Okay. So I do want to start with a reminder and acknowledgement that Clackamas County sits on the traditional lands and waterways of the Clackamas, Chugnik Bands, Kalapuya, Kathlamet, Malala, Multnomah, Tualatin, Tumwater, Wasco, and many other tribes on the Willamette Valley and Western Oregon. Hopefully you've already been dropping things into the chat. I've seen a lot of nice additions, and as Scott said, my name is Jerry Stroop. I'm the project manager with Nelson Nygaard, helping lead the consultant team in supporting the county. And with me is Carrie, who will be also presenting today. A brief update on where we are in our project process. We are at our third kind of public engagement milestone. So we have moved from kind of the early discovery phase of our project, where we're understanding the existing conditions, learning about what work has been done to date, moved through the desire phase to really understand what are the goals for Walk Bike Clackamas and what is the vision that we are working towards. And now we are in what I really think is the fun part, the design phase, where we're coming up with recommendations. We're getting closer to understanding what the recommendations of this plan will be for pedestrian and biking networks, and an update to the toolkit. So this is where we are at this summer point. We have one more milestone that's planned for this fall before we had or finalize the plan. And it's just a brief refresher. You have all seen this slide before, at least WBAC members have seen this slide before of what we are working towards, and it's having a set of bike and pedestrian projects, having them tiered into priorities, because we know that while there's a lot of opportunity, the county will need to prioritize what investments it's seeking. Shared streets program recommendations, we talked some about that at our last meeting. The facility design toolkit, performance measures, and policy and program priorities. So we've made a lot of progress towards a lot of these efforts, and over the last 6 months in particular. So since we last met, we have taken a lot of the feedback that we had from you, from stakeholder engagement, to update and finalize our goals. We heard loud and clear that our goals were on the right track, but they needed some more distinction. Separated safety and accessibility into separate goals. We finalized program recommendations and added to a lot of the programs that the county already has, or made some suggestions to strengthen them. But added some program recommendations like micromobility programs or shared mobility programs, a bike and pedestrian count program, campaigns around bicycle-friendly driver campaigns and education, or no parking in the bike lanes, and then school zone safety. That was another topic that we've heard. There's a lot of support around having some campaigns around school zone safety. Open Streets is another program suggestion that we've had, and kind of speaks to having streets open to people walking and biking, and closing them off to cars and kind of reimagining their use. And that's kind of related to the work we did to finalize the shared streets network. So we talked some at our last meeting about what shared streets are, what kinds of design features they might include, and what are some candidate shared streets in Clackamas County. And you can find a lot of that information and those finalized memos on the project website. We're going to share with you some of the findings that we had from our gaps and deficiencies analysis, and this was really the basis for sharing or creating our prioritization criteria and our process to identify projects. And we did that also by meeting with other agency partners. So we'll share a little bit about that too. Okay. I mentioned we've been doing some stakeholder engagement. So beyond all meeting with you over the 2 times since last fall, you're aware that we did have some public engagement milestones. We had a virtual open house back in the fall, and that was got a lot of feedback through that, which was super helpful in finalizing those goals. And a lot of open-ended comments submitted and a lot of interactions with our online map, which again, we used in our project identification process. I'm going to just touch here on the themes we've heard from engagement, and hopefully this reflects what you've, your experience too, what you've heard among this group, but also what we've heard through public feedback. We know that people, that safety has really risen to the top and as a key issue in Clackamas County, and that a big part of that is because of a lack of infrastructure and physical separation from high volume traffic and kind of higher classification streets. And then we've also heard that collaboration is going to be really important for the county moving forward. So making sure to work with municipal partners, working with state partners, because very few or many county facilities overlap or abut other jurisdictions. I mentioned that we had an agency partner workshop, and so back on June 20th, the project team convened 13 staff from other municipalities. So this includes Canby, Estacada, Happy Valley, Lake Oswego, Milwaukee, the list goes on. And we talked with them about what projects they have planned or where they see opportunities to really collaborate with the county moving forward. We also talked with them about what types of facilities that they're testing out or they see as really promising in helping advance walking and biking in their communities, and that align with some of our goals for the Walk Bike Clackamas plan. So we heard about cycle tracks or protected bicycle lanes showing a lot of promise, rectangular rapid flashing beacons that in some cases those have been helpful, but also require a lot of education for drivers and people walking alike, just to understand how to use those types of features. And then also in some cases where things, kind of the land use context is more rural, that focusing active transportation improvements like multi-use paths or protected bicycle lanes can be really effective on one side of the road versus on both sides of the street. And that can even help avoid some drainage and runoff issues. So this was a lot of information that we gleaned from those partners, which was really helpful for us as we start thinking about potential improvements we'd like to recommend. Okay. Any questions just around our stakeholder engagement to date? And then I'm going to hand it off to Carrie to talk more about the findings we've had from the gaps and deficiencies analysis. I'll just take a look here at our chat if any pressing questions came up. Okay. Carrie, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerry. So as Jerry mentioned earlier, we're kind of getting to the fun part of the project. We're transitioning to capturing a more specific picture of where there are gaps and deficiencies in sidewalks and bikeways. This led us to do that gaps and deficiencies analysis, where we actually focused on 3 different analyses that you see on the screen. One is a bicycle level of traffic stress analysis, which measures roadway characteristics that create stressful conditions for biking. The other is a bicycle network analysis, which measures the level of connectivity to destinations using low stress facilities. And then the last is a pedestrian level of crossing stress, which measures how difficult it is to cross the street using those roadway characteristics. Next slide. I know some of these things can be a bit wonky and jargony, so I just wanted to dig in for a moment to the bicycle level of traffic stress. If you've biked, or even if you haven't, you've probably had a gut feeling of why you're uncomfortable on a road. And this analysis aims to quantify that feeling using metrics such as the number of lanes on a road, how wide a road is, how fast people drive, how many cars there are, etc. The output of this analysis is measured on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 is the least stressful that you can see on the left side of the screen. It's basically, it could be an idyllic trail, or it could be a very robustly separated bikeway. And on the other side, 4 is the most stressful output, which reflects a road with no bike facilities and is pretty highly trafficked. This analysis is helpful to use when we are looking at what types of bikeways to recommend or prioritize, because in a way it'll attract a certain user group. For example, a bicycle level of traffic stress 1 score on a road will likely attract families, young children, and people who are new to biking. And on the other side, a higher score will attract a smaller subset of people who are more strong and fearless enough to ride on high stress roads. Next slide. In applying this analysis to the county, we found that there are a range of low stress roads distributed across the county, as well as many high stress roads as well. We didn't find many level 2 or 3 stress roads. We also saw a correlation between the roads that were higher classification, which means streets that we rely on more for all modes of transportation. So a higher classification would be a collector or an arterial. And we also found that there's a correlation with roads that were higher volume. Many roads that were located outside of incorporated areas and in rural areas were a bicycle level of traffic stress 4, which is significant because those roads serve as key connections between communities. And lastly, we also found very few connections, very few convenient and low stress connections across the county. Next slide. Building off of that, the bicycle network analysis identifies census tracts that have good connectivity using those low stress roads and how well they connect to a series of everyday destinations. Again, we saw similar conclusions here. Roads in unincorporated Clackamas County rely more on those high stress roads for those connections. We also saw a higher density of low stress connections on the outskirts of incorporated areas. Next slide. And then lastly, the pedestrian level of crossing stress revealed that there are higher stress levels of crossing, again, those higher classification roads, those roads that we rely on more for all modes of transportation, as well as for higher volume roads. And crossings are important to mention because, especially on major corridors, a low stress route is only as good as its crossings. If you're on your neighborhood road and it's nice and peaceful and you're enjoying it, and maybe you want to just run errands or catch the bus, if you come to a busy intersection and that crossing is challenging, then that route will be challenging itself. Next slide.
There was a question about the in the chat about the map on slide 16.
Okay.
Could maybe a little more explanation, or Dean, I think you were the one who asked the question. If you want to express a little more what your question is.
And just confirming, this is the map. This is slide 16 that you had a question about.
Yeah, that's what Dean's chat message says. I don't understand the map on slide 16.
Yeah,
Is this slide
sorry.
16 here?
This is not slide 16, or at least it's not what I think is slide 16. It was the map before this one.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, that one.
Mhm.
I don't understand. So there's on the lower left, it's got the legend bicycle network analysis score, and then it's got these scores, and it's got those colors on the map. And I really don't understand. I was looking at this online before, and I just don't understand what those colors are really signifying.
Yeah, so great question. So looking at the legends, the higher the score or the darker the color signifies areas that are either more highly connected with the roadway network, or they have a denser, higher density of destinations that people want to go to. So like a grocery store or the doctors or just things like that. And so
Okay.
I know.
So these colors don't have anything to do with the stress level of the previous slide.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. You've answered my question. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks.
We'll head on to the next slide.
Yeah. Thank you, Jerry. Really quickly, I wanted to mention with all of these analyses, we took into account of many different factors, but especially locations where people walking or biking have been involved in crashes. And we looked at those locations across the county, as well as based on the facility ownership, to inform where there's a deficiency in our roads and how our roads work for people. So next slide. All that to say, wrapping it up, we see a lot of key opportunities here across Clackamas County, specifically along and across arterials in a few different places, east of Milwaukee on 82nd and a few other locations, across state-owned roads and highways, including I-205, 26, and 99, as well as streets that connect to or funnel into I-205, and lastly, opportunities to improve the network between Sandy and Estacada. And with these opportunities, we want to acknowledge the constraints as well, both human-made, such as I-205, and infrastructure such as that, in addition to those natural barriers such as topography and natural waterways, as well as large swaths of agricultural land that just elongate the distance between one destination or another, or impact how direct that connection is. So that brings us to the end of summary of this gaps and deficiencies analysis. Are there any other questions before we move on in the presentation?
Yeah, I know in the chat, thank you for elevating, Ellen, this question from Jay about what is the action plan for bicycle level of traffic stress 4 on roads? And is I guess a clarifying question in response to that, are you asking what is the response of this plan in terms of streets that receive that classification? I guess maybe while you are looking for a unmute button, I'll just note that
Sherry, was that for me?
yes, the question.
Okay, if it's a street that's labeled as a classified as number 4, then in my mind, some action needs to be taken immediately for those types of streets. So, I mean, even a simple stripe down the road with a bike symbol would probably be the first step in that scenario, but I'm kind of wondering if that's in the plan.
That's a great question. Carrie, would you like to respond to it? I'm happy to.
Yeah, yeah, Jay, great point there. I will say that when we move into our next few topics, the bicycle level of traffic stress measurements were taken into account when we identified projects, as well as when we ranked each project. So we are taking that into account, as well as with many other different criteria.
Thank you.
Great. And there's one other question that I noticed in the chat that I do think is worth acknowledging before we move on, about just why are agricultural lands a barrier? And in brief, I'll note that typically those are private lands and are designed to be large swaths of land that make it really difficult for a public facility to go through it. And so they just present natural kind of gaps within a network, or might cause facilities being designed to have out of direction travel. Carrie, or did you want to add more to that?
No, I think you summed it up perfectly, Jerry. It just elongates the distance that someone would have to take to get to point B, even if as the crow flies, even if your destination is just around the bend, there's just a lower density of roads, so there are fewer options to get to your destination.
Great. Okay. And one more question here from Katie about state-owned roads. Sounds like your question is, you would think that they would be state-owned roads and highways would be a constraint as they aren't owned and managed by the county, but should be a priority goal. So in some way that's reflected here, and that's some of the opportunities we do see are along state-owned roads or facilities, and highways like I-205 being a constraint. I think you'll see as we start talking about the prioritization process and project identification process and how we're thinking about that, it might address some of that and how we're taking that into account. So in the interest of time, shall we move on to that next section here on how what we've done with all of this and moving into prioritization?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Lots of great questions, but in the interest of time, we're going to dive into our project identification and prioritization. These two items help us to get to that long list of projects that specify how we're going to implement all these great projects and how we're going to make these improvements. There are a number of different ways that at the end of the day, we can get to that list, and I'll go over how we did that for this project. But first, I'll just start with the method of the method that we set up prior to identifying projects, which is how we set up our prioritization goals and measures. Before going any further, I'll just say that this material is in draft form, and we'll be incorporating public input on all of this work from here on out, as well as feedback that this committee has. So specifically, the step of prioritization is developing a list of prioritized projects is a key. Sorry, I am misreading my notes. But essentially, this prioritization step is a framework for how we decide which projects to prioritize. I'll say that all projects are worthy and important, but this step in the process helps the county to decide what to implement first. And as we decide this through a series of measurable criteria, it's just want to mention it's very quantitatively based. Next slide, Jerry. We started this step by returning to our Walk by Clackamas goals that you can see on the left. And we also identified some of those goals as key project values, namely safety, connectivity, equity, and health. These values were emphasized during this step, this prioritization methodology. I'll quickly note that we do not include criteria about sustainability because by implementing walking and biking projects, we took the approach of of thinking that we're inherently shifting transportation choices towards modes that are more environmentally friendly and have less of a footprint. Next slide, please. In addition to the project goals and those key project values, we also looked back at the work that we've done to date for this plan and used those technical memos as the basis for creating criteria to measure these projects. So in the next few slides, I'll walk through each of these goals and the criteria under them. One thing I wanted to point out, you'll notice that for many of these goals, there's a criteria of whether a project addresses a public comment. And this originated from the public comments from the online map from earlier this year. And we took those comments, coded them based on the goals, essentially asking, does this comment express a safety concern or a connectivity issue? And based on this coding, we factored it into as a criterion for each goal area that spoke to whether a project addresses that public comment. So just to note, you'll see that for each of these goal areas. Great, so first up, the measures for safety include crashes within a certain distance, crossing improvements, whether a project is from a Safe Routes to School action plan, as well as whether the project addresses a public comment expressed from a safety concern. Next slide. The measures for accessibility were based on whether a project improves walkways or bikeways to a certain number of destinations, whether it addresses access to transit, is located within the Clackamas Regional Center or within a rural community, as well as addresses a public safety concern or public access concern. Next slide. For measures for our connectivity goal, we measured whether a project addresses missing bikeway gaps and walking gaps, as well as whether the project expands the miles of bikeways along a road that's scored as highly stressful, getting back to that BLTS4 measurement. Well, we also factored in whether a project overlaps with the essential pedestrian network, in addition to whether a project completely or partially fills a missing sidewalk gap on a certain classification of road. Next slide. For equity, we factored in whether a project is located within a census tract where 50% or more of the project is located in census block groups that were measured as above average or well above average for the equity index score that we calculated earlier in the project. Next slide. And then lastly, for the measure of goal 6 for health, we measured whether a project is located within a half-mile radius of a park, a hospital, a long-term care facility, as well as a few other destinations, including elementary, middle, or schools or daycares. Next slide. So that was a lot of information, but the slide that you see here essentially sums up everything that I just went over. So I believe now we're going to transition to a quick live poll on menti.com unless there are any burning questions.
I just had one thought for accessibility that kind of came up recently. I was riding with my kids up to the grocery store and they had removed all the bike staples, so there was no more bike parking. So I'm wondering if there are any rules or requirements within unincorporated Clackamas County for especially destinations like hospitals, schools, grocery stores, to have a certain amount of bike parking. And if not, if that might be something we could add, because, you know, especially with how much bike theft there is in the area, it really would make a person think twice about grocery shopping if there's no bike parking.
Yeah, I can take that, Jerry. Yeah, great question. the county does have requirements for bike parking associated with new development. So if a grocery store comes in and is constructed, they'd be required to install bike parking at that time. In a case like this, it could have been a requirement at the time of development. And if they're removed, then they would have to, comply with their permit to have bike parking. So it's something I could definitely look into and see if I could find the original land use permit that would dictate how much bike parking they were required to have. Which grocery store was it, Marika?
It's the Safeway on Webster. But that's good to know too. If I notice there's no bike parking, that's potentially something that could be fixed if they're required to have it.
Yeah, it's a relatively new requirement. So there would be a lot of development, pre-existing that law. But if there's, a change of use, for example, like if a business changes from one business to another, that could trigger a requirement to have bike parking. So it's kind of a case by case basis, but the law to have that in the zoning code requirement legally is relatively new.
Okay. Yeah, that's
So
great.
I can look into it though. You said the Safeway where?
On Webster.
Webster. Okay, I know where that
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Really good question and observation. And not something that we've heard a lot about yet. So in terms of through this project process. So, all right, well, we know that it will be helpful for you to see what the kind of draft projects are that we have, but we want to get at first your kind of gut reaction to these, the criteria that we've outlined here. And so I'm dropping in the chat and encourage you to go to menti.com, and I'm going to just, if you entered the code there that I dropped in the chat, I will pull up a new slide that is asking you to kind of consider how you would weight these different goal areas, what you would weight more heavily relative to something else. So let me just reshare so we can check out results as they are coming in. Is everyone able to get here? Yes, starting to see some answers come through. So seeing that again, safety and accessibility are rising to the top here, which is not surprising given the trends we've seen from this group. Would anyone feel comfortable sharing or raising their hand to kind of share why they're ranking things the way they are? Marika? Or sorry, I thought I saw you come off mute, but no, I didn't.
I think Jay had.
Looks like Jay had his hand up.
Jay?
Am I on?
You're on.
Yeah, I think safety should be at the top of the list, and the reason being is that if you create a safe environment for pedestrians and cyclists, you're going to have more. Simple as that. That's probably the number one complaint in the area that I live in, is people do not feel safe quite often when riding their bike or walking, more so riding their bike. And I think the situation in Clackamas County is getting better. There's a lot of improvements that are happening, but I still think we've got a ways to go to really make any kind of headway. The city of Milwaukee is creating a loop around the city that separates bike traffic from autos, and that's going to be excellent. So safety is the number one reason I think to keep people out there riding and walking.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. I think that echoes a lot of what we've heard. And kind of this desire for not just physically protected facilities, but even completely separated facilities. That sounds like that's a popular idea. All right, this is a very similar but slightly different question we're going to prompt you with now. So we had about 13 responses to that last one. I'm hoping we'll have about this similar here. But if you could rank just your top 2. Interesting. So safety again at the top, but accessibility going a little bit lower. When you factor in what else might be the highest priority. And welcome, Jake. Happy to have you.
Thank you. Safety is kind of on my mind after just getting out of the ER.
Oh my goodness. Scott shared, and I'm glad you are safe and doing okay.
Yeah, Jake, good to see you. I'm glad everything's okay, but sorry to hear about that.
Thanks. It happened in Multnomah County. If you get, makes you guys feel better.
Okay. Well, this is great. With someone that, let's see, did anyone not have safety as their top that would feel comfortable describing why? And maybe that's nobody. Okay, this is just a safety loving crew. Someone that elected to have connectivity at the top, or at, up there in the top 2. Is someone willing to share more about that?
Maybe this had been mentioned before. I remember talking about it at previous meetings, but it's hard to kind of rank these because they're so interrelated. They all kind of one leads to the next. I think safety is an easy one to kind of pick at the top because no one's going to use the infrastructure if there isn't at least perceived safety of using it. But as far as connectivity and accessibility, those are, if it's connected, it's accessible. And of course, applying that infrastructure equally throughout all of the county and regions, not based one neighborhood or the other. And then of course, all of those things lead to the health equity of that. So it's kind of hard to rank, I think, the other ones as they all are kind of interconnected.
Yeah.
I would second what she just said and also add that to me, connectivity does come first, because if it's that's sort of the baseline of what we're doing. It's like we're connecting things. And of course, we have to connect them safely. We can't connect them without safety in mind. But having safety first bothers me only because the safest thing is just to don't walk and don't bike. You just stay home. That's really safe. As soon as you connect things, if you get more people out there, you're probably going to have more accidents, even if you make it as safe as you can. Just the virtue of there being more people out, out there that makes more targets or more likelihood that something bad's going to happen. But I think connectivity is the key to the whole thing. It's connecting the places we need to connect to, and obviously do it safely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dean and Marika, for those observations. I think you're exactly right that there are a lot of these that are very similar and connected, which is why we wanted to ask these 2 different questions, both on how you'd weight and then how you'd rank. I'll call on Katie next, but I'm gonna also just use this as an opportunity to encourage folks to use the raise your hand function, just because that will help us if multiple people do want to speak or respond to a question or prompt. It'll allow us to call on folks without speaking over each other. Katie, go ahead.
I think two of the things that I look at are kind of a different way of looking at the prioritization. One is health. Underneath the different the columns, each of the columns, what you're looking at with health is within a half-mile radius of a park, hospital, long-term care, pharmacy, grocery store, a public elementary or middle school. And it's really about focusing our improvements, our capital improvements in infrastructure and sidewalks and bike lanes in those areas where people are don't have access to those things and to be able to get to those things. So for me, this is really that piece of connectivity that I think I hear people talking about, as opposed to the connectivity column that says filling the gaps. But this connectivity is about filling the gaps. Health is more about getting people to those things that they want and need to get to and don't want to have to get into their car to get to. And then for me, secondarily, the other piece is equity. I think a focus on getting people to the things that they need to get to without getting into a vehicle, and especially those people that have less resources to be able to do so and don't have access to a vehicle, should be able to find a way to get there by using bicycles and walking to get to the things that they need. So for me, and for the work that we do, those are two of the big priorities.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And I think you're emphasizing those is also part of why we carried those through as key values going into our prioritization process. I'm going to call on Debbie and then move on into our next section on project identification. And we'll just acknowledge too that we see a lot of great conversation happening in the chat and are documenting that. It will not be lost, specifically some things around topography, and we'll have an opportunity for you to interact with our draft project maps, and would love your help identifying some of those areas with really challenging topography that we should keep in mind. Debbie.
Yes, the connectivity is a really important one for me, because I live in Gladstone. Within Gladstone on our little local streets, getting around is fine, but there's like nothing here. So I need to go to another area to get to the hospital or the park or the next town or whatever. And those connections to go visit my parents in Canby, those connections are not always there or available. And so that's a really critical thing. In order to get from here to there, I have to have that connection.
It's a really good point. And thank you, Debbie. Okay, I see it getting applause. Some good reactions. All right. Moving on to our project identification section. And so we'll dive into this and aim to kind of head towards a group discussion on these around 8 o'clock here. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. And thank you all for that really thoughtful feedback. It's really helpful. So yes, we are moving into project identification. Next slide, please. So just a quick word on framing this approach. When we got started, we found that there were a lot of good projects that were developed in past plans that still hadn't been built yet. So we're bringing all those projects in those plans forward, as well as adding new projects to address priority geographies in need of solutions. So you can see that first bucket there on the far left. We pulled projects, about 300 projects from the county's transportation system plan, and those projects addressed walking and biking facilities. So we pulled those forward. We also grabbed about 100 projects from Safe Routes to School action plans throughout the county in unincorporated areas. So using those projects as our foundation, we also, again, took that public feedback from the online map earlier this year to identify some of the gaps that the TSP and Safe Routes projects didn't quite fill, see if there was anything that came up that wasn't already addressed. Next, we also looked at existing networks from the previous active transportation plan from the shared streets network to see, again, if there was anything that wasn't already addressed in those projects. I'll just pause to quickly point out the existing networks that I'm referring to, the priority active transportation routes and the essential pedestrian network. Those, like I mentioned, are from previous plans that are networks that say we want to focus active transportation improvements on these routes in particular. So they're not necessarily routes that have infrastructure yet, but they are areas that in past planning processes, the county has said, okay, we want to focus on making this road better. So we're keeping in mind those networks, as well as adding that final layer of those new analyses I mentioned earlier, the bicycle level of traffic stress, the pedestrian crossing stress, as well as that the equity index also mentioned earlier, where we identified areas that had equity, had an equity focus. Really quickly, I just want to mention that in this project, we're not addressing new project needs on ODOT facilities, but we are prioritizing existing projects on ODOT roads against each other to help the county collaborate with the state. So just noting that that's a part of this conversation, but we're putting that aside for right now. So moving on to project recommendations. Again, this slide summarizes how we got to this point. And moving into project prioritization, we're basically combining that prioritization framework we talked about earlier, as well as all those projects that we identified. And essentially, we are coming up with this long list of recommended projects, splitting those into three buckets, if you will. Projects that are located within unincorporated Clackamas County. A handful of projects that bridge that county and local jurisdiction boundary that are still really noteworthy to mention. And then lastly, as I mentioned, projects that are located on ODOT facilities. Again, mentioning them, acknowledging them, but setting them aside for now. And through this process, we came up with a list of over 460 projects that were ordered by priority. From this list of tier projects, we included projects, as I mentioned, between these three jurisdictions and have a very long list of projects. I'll point out that we have a bit over 300 projects that are specifically located within unincorporated Clackamas County. Next slide, Jerry. So as we've mentioned in previous work, maybe not in this meeting yet, but the county is divided into 5 sub-areas for planning purposes. This table that you see summarizes the number of projects by tiers across those sub-areas. I'll walk through priority projects within those sub-areas in a moment, and then afterwards we'll transition to more of a discussion using a Miro board for you to dive deeper into those projects and where they are. And as we dive into those maps and projects, I want to remind folks again that these are draft materials and that things may change as we start our new engagement phase. And as we seek input from you all tonight, as well as members of the public specifically about how projects are tiered. So I know this is a lot of information, but just to say up front, for right now, we really want to make sure that you understand this process that we used. We're also going to allow you some time after this meeting, again, to just digest all of this and to make sure that you understand it. And specifically, we wanted to ask you to use your lived experience and your expertise as community members to say if there are any contextual details that were not captured in our data inputs that could inform us about tiering and how these projects shook out. So I just wanted to ask folks to keep that in mind as I walk through the next few slides. And after that, we'll do a deeper dive into those maps. Next slide. And so starting with the Northwest area, we didn't have any tier 1 projects, but we did have a number of tier 2 and 3. Some examples of that are, again, since we have different sources of projects, we have some safe routes, some transportation system plan projects, as well as manual projects, which is referring to those gaps that our team identified in this planning process. So we have a few examples of different project types here on the right, as well as just, you can see on the map a number of different tiered projects. I'll quickly point out that in the legends, blue projects are high priority, yellow are medium, and red are low priority projects. So next slide. Shifting over to the greater McLaughlin area, we did have some tier 1 projects that bubbled to the top. A lot of those were east-west crossings over McLaughlin Boulevard itself. And we also had some north-south segments as parallel routes to McLaughlin Boulevard. Next slide. Moving on over to the Greater Clackamas Regional Center, we had, again, a number of significant tier 1 projects, as well as tier 2 and 3. Here you can see in the northern area, there's kind of a spaghetti grouping of projects in that northern area, pointing out projects on King Road, Monroe Street, and Harmony Drive. We also had some projects in the south area, kind of adjacent to I-205, as well as in the west, kind of tucked next to Happy Valley. Next slide. Shifting down to the southwest area, we didn't have any tier 1s, but we again had quite a few number of tier 2 and 3 projects. A lot of the tier 2 projects are roads on those more rural areas in Clackamas County, with a few tier 2 projects outside of incorporated areas. Next slide. And then coming to our last sub area, the eastern part of the county, no tier 1 projects, but a good number of tier 2 and 3 projects. Specifically in between Sandy and Estacada, as well as connections outside of those jurisdictions. Some multi-use trails, including the Cazadero multi-use trail, as well as routes that are parallel to 26. Next slide. So that's an overview of where these projects are and how they were prioritized. And I think that we're going to transition to a discussion now.
Yeah. Thank you, Carrie, for going through those. And hopefully you all have a better understanding of where the projects are located that we've identified, their tiering. And now we're going to let you have an opportunity to zoom in a little bit closer using a Miro board, so you can take as granular a look as you'd like at some of those maps, but also take a look at what types of projects we're recommending in those locations. Before we dive in to Miro, I will just note Debbie had a really good question in the chat about how do cities coordinate with these projects, and I'll just refresh that. At least one step in our planning process here, again, was that agency partner workshop where we brought a lot of different agencies together. But as Carrie also described in our project identification process, typically we're consulting a lot of other existing planning efforts and planning documents and maps that provide inputs into our process. But I wanted to ask Scott if there's more you wanted to elaborate on that while I'll transition us over to the Miro board.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. I'd also mention we have what's called CTAC, which is the Clackamas Transportation Coordinating Committee. So that's a monthly meeting that brings together all the cities in Clackamas County to share information, to coordinate on projects. It's run and by our principal transportation planner, Steve Williams. So that's really a forum for coordinating and sharing information on transportation projects. And so that's really one of the primary channels for working with our cities.
Really good question. Thanks, Scott. Okay. So I have dropped in the chat a link to a Miro board. I think we've taken you all to Miro before. You should be able to cancel out of any prompts where if it's asking you to log in or something, but I'm gonna just zoom out and orient you to what we have compiled here. And we've got over on the left prioritization criteria that you've already seen, but in case this is helpful to reference back to. We've also got the project identification, some of those key maps that Carrie talked us through, both in terms of equity focus areas and existing priority active transportation networks and essential pedestrian networks. Existing projects, both from Safe Routes to School and the Transportation System Plan documents. And finally, the map of tiered projects by county-wide, which we have over to the right by sub-area. I'm gonna just remind all of us here, if you are rusty on Miro and wondering how you navigate around this board, if you have a mouse, you can right-click to hold it down and drag it around, and it'll help get you where you want to go. You can scroll the mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and if you have a trackpad device, you can just hold down 2 fingers on your trackpad to move around the board, and then pinching fingers to zoom in and out. Carrie, would you like to kind of walk us through the directions here on this right side of the board?
Sure. So with all this information, I know it's a lot. We're inviting WBAC members to just walk through each map of the county using the project list below as a reference, and just provide any feedback that you have using sticky notes or emojis that we have pasted around the maps. Again, it's really great for you to provide that lived experience, and we're not looking for particular feedback on projects themselves, although we'll take that if you have it. But again, we want to focus on if we got the prioritization right, if we got the projects right, not necessarily the TSP and Safe Routes projects, but other projects that we use to kind of fill those gaps. Yeah, really just looking to see if asking if there's a pattern of projects that you think, a series of projects that really didn't make it to the top tier, but are in tier 3 that you think should be bumped up as you see fit. So Jerry's sharing a few questions that we have to help guide the feedback that we're looking for. So I think any feedback that you have that can address these questions would be really, really appreciated.
Thank you, Carrie. And let's just orient to one sub area together so you can see what kind of information we have here under the priority projects. If we take the Northwest County map, for instance, and zoom in here, just below it is the list of the projects that were in the highest scoring tier. So if you recall, this sub area did not have any tier 1 projects, but it did have tier 2 projects, and they are listed here in terms of their source, their extents, and a brief description of them. No need to pay too much attention to these pieces, but if you do want to look at just what the specific lengths are, all those details are here. And above the maps, and you're welcome to use the menu bar on the left to get your own sticky notes, but you can take a sticky note here and add in other comments you have and move those over, oops, onto the board. We recognize that some of you will have more familiarity with certain sub areas than others. So we wanted to give you just a little bit of time to explore this board. And let's give you at least 3 minutes here. And please, if you do have questions or things that you want to elevate, just raise your hand and we can take those one at a time.
I have a question. Is there any way you can move the draft watermarks on these maps so that we can actually get around and see a little better the maps themselves?
Sure.
And the actual proposed projects on the maps?
Yeah, I think I can make that change pretty easily here,
Thank you.
I think. I say that, but just a minute. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing while I mess with it. Anybody having any issues getting to their map? I'll go ahead and move those watermarks off to the side.
Jerry, I'm also helping to move those watermarks for what it's worth.
Thank you. All right, I'm starting to see some comments come through.
I'm not able to find the map.
Are you in the Miro, Dean?
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's probably the reason.
I'll drop the link in the chat again. See if that's helpful to take you there.
Yeah.
And I take the quiet or silence as a good sign that folks are focused and immersed. But I'm curious to hear if anybody sees anything that's kind of surprising to them. Anybody see any projects that they're excited about?
I will say I'm excited about the crossing on 77th and King. I actually was just noticing that the other day when I was driving, just a lot of people just crossing in the middle of that street, kind of willy-nilly. So it's good to see that pop up.
Yeah, trying to cross there with a kid and a cargo bike that's not electric is just madness. I just feel like I'm taking my life into my hands.
Yeah.
Another issue I have run into when biking is street sweepers will clean the car paths and they shove all the debris into the bike path, which makes the bike path really dangerous. And I don't know if that's something that needs to be communicated or coordinated.
Yeah, and that was Debbie. You mentioned that. Yeah, that's a good point. It is not necessarily a project recommendation, but certainly project design can influence that. Scott, I'm not sure if there's more you're aware of just in terms of the county's maintenance standards and policies around clearing bike lanes and sweeping debris.
Yeah, we do have a sweeping schedule for bike lanes, and we do try to get through all the county maintained roads with bike lanes on a regular basis. I don't know, maybe Rob, do you know what the cycle is on that and when those are, like how often that's done? I'm not sure of the actual cycle, but I know there's a regular maintenance that's done. I could look into that and get back to WBAC on that.
If I could jump in for a moment, there was a really good comment on the greater McLaughlin area map about why there aren't any improvements on McLaughlin Boulevard itself. So the reason is that these maps show potential projects on roads that the county has jurisdiction over. So McLaughlin Boulevard itself is a larger beast of a project that ODOT is taking the lead on. And again, it's not to say that the county doesn't care about improvements on McLaughlin. It's just that these maps showcase projects on county streets. So just wanted to point that out.
Thanks, Carrie.
I'm glad to see that somebody else is really excited about the Concord improvement as well with the new library and community center going in. Do we know exactly, what the move up date could be and exactly what they're doing on that Concord road, especially like right there at the Oatfield and Concord intersection?
I don't, Neil. So are you talking about improvements on Concord and in association with the building there, or?
Yeah, so basically I live in the neighborhood just up the hill from there on Concord, but above Oatfield, and everybody is super excited for this to come into the neighborhood, the library and stuff, but everybody hates crossing Oatfield and going down Concord. So I was here to kind of see what was going on with that. It looks like it's well in the works. So I just kind of wanted to see if we know what that exact plan was, or what the date looks like on that. If you don't, that's totally fine. I know it's very granular, but.
Yeah, well, actually, maybe Katie, if you're still here from NC Party, do you know the answer to that?
I was gonna say, I don't know the answer to that. I don't believe that either project is required to do improvements on Concord Road, especially that far kind of up along Concord Road. I do know that the community center is being required to do improvements along the sidewalk, along the community center, along the old school, the historic school there. But I don't know that there are requirements to do any changes to the road itself.
Yeah, I went to the last, the meeting there where they were involving the community and stuff. And I asked that question. They said, yes, there is not any, but you should go to the bike walk path committee meetings and see what they have to say. So.
And that's why I'm here, so that we can say that we do think that this is an area to make improvements, but it's beyond the project of the library or the park district.
Thank you, Katie. Marika, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, since we were on the map, I just wanted to say I really liked everything on that previous map we were on, kind of that
McLaughlin. This one?
area. Yeah, that looks super great. I think the prioritization is good. One thing I wasn't sure of, since it didn't on the, if we scroll down to
The project.
the lists are. I know that, I think we've talked about before, the crossings there in the existing bike infrastructure on Trolley Trail, kind of where it crosses, I think that might be Bluebird, is the name of the street there. Those kind of several crossings under the bridge. I don't know if that was in the project, but those are always a little bit clunky to get through. I was just writing there with Northwest Association for Blind Athletes, and I really could see the barriers that folks have going through that section where the crosswalks are. I think there's 3 in a row.
Yeah. I don't know, Carrie, if you or Scott, if either of you are aware that that might be in, we're just listing the tier 1 projects here. I don't know if that would have happened to be separate or is included. But we can,
Is Bluebird up north, up in Milwaukee?
No, it's, and I may be totally wrong on the street names, and it might actually be on that list, but I just don't know what the street is. But it's right where I think there's a new maybe pub right there, or bar, like River View or something like that. But it's where the Max train goes, underneath that bridge there.
Oh, yeah, I know where you're talking.
Just
That's in Milwaukee.
Oh, is that
It's in Milwaukee.
Just north of the Park Avenue Max station.
It becomes Milwaukee.
Okay.
And it's a really difficult intersection for everybody.
Yeah.
And they've done some things throughout the years, both with the city and NCPRD, to try to improve accessibility and view shed, but it's a difficult, there's too much going on there, basically.
Yeah.
okay. Well, in the interest of time and making sure we get you out of here on time this evening, we are going to transition to our public comment period. So we will have 10 minutes of public comment. That being said, these maps are going to stay open for you to review. And I do just want to emphasize that this is intended for WBAC members, for them to provide input. If you are a member of the public and you've joined this meeting, you are obviously viewing this as well. But keep in mind, we are going to do a public phase of engagement in just a few weeks, but wanted to get this in front of our advisory committee first to get your feedback. So you have through the end of this month, which this month is coming to a close, to please add your comments, add questions. You're welcome to, on the far side of this, again, add any thoughts you have around that prioritization criteria as it relates to how things are tiered. Okay. So I'm going to do any questions about that before we move to the public comment, and just your homework in this area. Okay. Ellen, may I hand it over to you?
You may. If anyone from the public would like to comment or ask questions, if you could raise your hand, we'll ask you to speak in the order in which you raise your hand. You're also welcome, of course, to go ahead and put your comments into chat, and we'll have those for later. As Jerry mentioned, we'll be keeping those comments. I see Bruce Parker. Bruce?
Now, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay. I am a member of the public. I am on the Clackamas County Bike and Ped Advisory Committee. I am concerned that you got 5 regions, and when you list the number of tiers projects, they're all clustered in two of the regions. You have 3, mostly rural, which have none. It seems, I mean, I agree most of them should be in those regions, but it seems like a problem with equity that the urban areas are neglected. It seems like there would have been 1 or 2 in those regions. Thank you very much for letting me express my opinion.
Thank you, Bruce. Anybody want to, Scott or anybody want to comment on that, on Bruce's concern?
I think it's a great point that Bruce makes, and I think keep in mind that these are drafts. This is an initial, just getting started with the project list and prioritization. So I think that's something, as we go forward and get to, developing a plan, that's something we should take a closer look at. So I think it's a good point.
Would anyone else like to make a comment or ask a question? I don't see anybody who wishes to speak. I think we've had some interactions already with folks through the chat, and that's great. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Jerry.
Okay. Great. Well, this feels rare. I feel like our past meetings, we've had a lot more public comment. So we will just proceed on to next steps and making sure you're seeing the right slides. If someone can give me a thumbs up, next steps. Okay, I'm seeing nods. Thank you. All right. So what will we be doing with all of your input, and how will we be proceeding with this list of draft projects? You are getting the first view of these and our draft tiering, as Carrie shared. Next, we will be working on packaging these up in a way that we can share them with the public for public comment and input. We plan to have a presence in person at some community events and take advantage of kind of summertime activities, both with North Clackamas Park, the Parks and Rec Department, working with them on their Movies in the Park event. So on Saturday, August 12th, we hope that you might share with your networks and maybe even come attend yourself. We'll plan to have a table there for folks filtering in before the movie. We're also working with the coordinators there to have some fun trivia to kind of drum up interest and build awareness about this planning activity, and drive people, if they don't engage with us at that event, through posters, point them to an online survey where they can also take a look at these draft maps and have that open for a couple weeks, but not a super long time. This isn't going to be the 30-day period, just because we are working on a tight time frame to wrap up this project and our plan at the end of this year. We'll have a presence at the county fair the week following, and then we will be taking all of this to finalize those projects. And once we've got that final list, we can do some costing and estimating and come up with a funding strategy for the county. And as to some of your questions before around how does the county partner with or coordinate with other jurisdictions, we'll also be looking at what are the opportunities to tackle some projects jointly. We have an update to the county's facility design toolkit, and that will be a key piece of work we're doing in parallel over the next month or so. We've heard a lot of great input from a lot of you about what kinds of facilities are really most important, what features and elements do they need to have. to deliver on the Walk by Clackamas goals. So we'll be working on that and look forward to sharing that with you when we see you next. And we'll be bringing to you the first real draft of our plan in October. So that is what we are working towards heading into the fall. And then we'll have kind of some, take that to the public heading into the holiday season. Our asks of you are to help promote our public outreach and events, and whatever kind of online component we'll have that will complement those in-person events. Again, we are asking for your input on these draft projects. If you're having any issues as well, just using the Miro board, a member of our team, I mentioned this in the chat, is happy to troubleshoot with you, our WBAC members. So you can get in touch with Scott or get in touch with me directly, and we're happy to kind of walk through that. Or you can submit your comments separately in an email. So that is also an option. And we will be seeing you again in October. And I think the last thing I wanted to do, just as a piece of housekeeping, is that for those of you that have indicated an interest or request for stipend, we do have some more information on that. And we'll be following up with folks after today's meeting. So please stay tuned on that. I'll ask Scott if there's more he wanted to add on that note or in closing.
Yeah, as long as we have a couple minutes, actually, I'll kind of rely on Seth for that, but there will be, and Seth, correct me if I'm wrong. So we will be circling back with WBAC members regarding the stipend and with forms that you will need to fill out for the stipend. And look for that from myself. It'll be from me. But Seth, was there anything you wanted to add on that front?
Yeah, I think the main point now is ODOT has revamped their system a little bit. Hopefully it will be easier and more efficient and have more options for you all. So even though there's more paperwork, I'm hoping in the end it's a benefit. The first email will come from Scott in terms of what's going on, and then the subsequent emails with forms will come from me.
Thank you, Scott and Seth, for clarifying what's to come with that. Any questions about that specifically? I see another couple of questions in the chat I'll respond to, but around stipends. So one question was just whether the Menti, if you can continue to use the Menti, and so that the Mentimeter poll is closed after today's meeting, but the Miro board, the place with all of these maps and the list of projects, will stay open through Monday. And thank you very much, Nicole, for catching the typo on the slide. The county fair does start on the 15th, which is a Tuesday, not a Monday. So we'll edit that before we finalize or resend out these slides. And there's a really good question about whether or not you can all receive the full project list that goes with the maps. We opted to share with you just those highest scoring ones today. And I guess really that may be just a question to the county or Scott, kind of your level of comfort with sharing that full project list.
Yeah,
that we
that's
can add
fine.
to the Miro, or okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, can that be added to the Miro? That we're fine with that. To have the whole list.
I think that's easy to do. Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's easy to do. We can do that.
Good question. Okay, that is all the content that we had for you all this evening. Are there any other questions about your next steps or our next steps?
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. It was really great to have such awesome attendance. So props to all of you. Nice to see you all again. We really appreciate your participation in this process. It's helping us do our job a lot better, having your involvement and input along the way. And we really look forward to continuing this conversation, seeing the feedback that you have, and coming back to you in the fall. So I hope you all have a great evening and rest of your summer. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.